This video is for reading 23. It's entitled The View from the Country Club, Wealthy Whites and the Matrix of Privilege, and it's written by Jessica Holden Sherwood. Similar to reading 21, this reading is a good example of the intersectional lens in action. So Sherwood begins her piece by asking the question and providing a justification for her focus on country clubs. And she discusses this in regards to the importance of looking up, not just down. And that means that when oftentimes in sociology, as well as other social sciences, when we're talking about inequality and we're wanting to collect, data to understand the experiences that people have um, in regards to their social class identity and their experiences with inequality, we oftentimes look down. We focus on, people that are towards the bottom of the social class ladder, and this is for a variety of reasons. Compared to the people at the top of the social class ladder, people at the bottom are more accessible. They're usually more open to incentives to participate in research. They're less wary about how they're going to be portrayed. It's easier to kind of integrate into some of those circles and settings in order to access them. And so, although it is very important to look up, to study up, it can just be difficult to access those people. So the author makes it very apparent at the beginning of the reading that she was able to use her own social location in order to study up. And she mentions the fact that she herself, she is a white woman. She is obviously, educated. She has the cultural capital to be able to interact with them, as she says, effectively and comfortably. She even knows some people in their social circles. So all of this is what allowed her to be able to engage in this research. And so, once again, similar to reading 21, the piece by Betty, this is a piece where we have a discussion of methodology, right? It's based on this author's actual, research that she engaged in and data that she collected. And so she discusses her methodology fairly early on in the reading. She's focused on the most exclusive slash prestigious social clubs in her area. She uses her personal contacts to start a snowball sample. And snowball sampling is what it sounds like. If you think about a snowball at the top of the hill, as it rolls down the hill, it gathers additional snow and it gets bigger. And that's how snowball sampling works. You start with people that you know or you have access to, and you collect data from them, and then you tap into their networks in order to grow your sample. So, all in all, her sample winds up being um, 38 uh, country club member interviews, and they come from different clubs, and she gives them pseudonyms. 21 are from Old Family, which we learn is the most prestigious. Is called typical blue blood waspy type of club. Waspy meaning white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. 11 are from two other similar clubs. One she calls Rosary, and one she calls Suburban. She notes that Rosary also has a pretty long history, and it wound up just somewhat developing into a club for Irish Catholics, as opposed to the more Protestant Old Family Club. Suburban is a newer club, and it's seen as being one that's frequented by club members who are new money. And then finally, she has 6 from Northern, which she does note that this is, this club is different. It's in a slightly different geographical location, and it's less prestigious. And she says she primarily includes it because some of the women that golf at Northern really pushed back against some of the restrictions, the gender based restrictions that existed there. And so she wanted to include them as kind of a point of comparison. And she is collecting this data largely through interview design. She is asking the sample questions primarily about how they can account for the exclusion in their clubs in regards to class, race, and gender. And so in this reading, she does lightly discuss, the class nature of these country clubs. By their very nature, the fact that people have to, be invited to join, and they have to be able to afford it. That means that, they share a somewhat similar class position. So where the variation among these club members and in between these clubs, where the variation really exists is along race and gender. And so, in regards to race, she does note that membership has become more diverse, but is still largely white. But the context is still cultural white, which I thought was very interesting to kind of consider. How a place or a setting can be culturally a specific race. So even if other racial groups and ethnic groups are in that setting, to a certain extent, they have to be able to conform and to assimilate and to not make and to not disrupt the kind of cultural racial identity of the setting, which is a point that she makes, that they have been able to achieve some racial diversity at these country clubs without multiculturalism because of assimilation. Because true multiculturalism would be a blend of cultures, and other people's cultural identities would be readily, apparent in those settings. Instead, what has happened is that, people who are not white are able to join, but they need to be able to assimilate, to that specific kind of cultural context, which she describes as being culturally white. Interesting things that come up about race is, oftentimes, they would offer some justification for the homogeneity of the club, the fact that it's still largely white, but then they would emphasize to what extent they are heterogeneous, right? To what extent diversity does exist. And they oftentimes would do this by comparing themselves to other clubs. So, bragging about their diversity by pointing out how they're more diverse than another club. When they do justify why there isn't more diversity, they usually link it back to social class, and the affordability. And she notes that, they do that without addressing kind of the legacy of institutionalized discrimination that has led to a lot of people of color having less established wealth, and not having these established contacts and social capital in these wealthy circles. A lot of this diversity has been, post 1970s, post 1980s. So maybe about a generation and a half in the making. But they don't talk about it on that level. Certainly the focus of the reading though isn't race, it's gender. And so she makes a lot of points about gender, and I'm not going to go over all of them on the video, in this video, but I do want to make sure that I hit some of the high points. So unlike racial minorities who have not always been present at the club, women have always been at the club, but they're there in the space of having a very kind of traditional gender norm. They're there as wives, mothers, to a lesser extent, maybe even daughters. And she says that this can be seen just looking at some of the club policies that used to exist, where, in regards to who had the family membership or the primary membership, it had to be established by the man of the house. And this was even used to be referred to as man of the house policies. Obviously, in contemporary society, that type of wording no longer flies. But I think she makes the point that the intent is still there. And unlike unlike the views on racial inequality, where to a certain extent, the club members do emphasize, that they want their clubs to at least appear to be somewhat diverse, and they see some good in having at least some racial ethnic minorities as members. A lot of members just don't really see gender inequality as problematic within the club. And she talks about this in three primary ways. One of those ways is just related to the fact that a lot of the women are in the club through their marriages to rich men, and they have they are homemakers, and their husbands are breadwinners. And she talks about the dominance of this type of household within this sample. And it's worth noting because although this type of household was more common in the 50s or 60s, it's become less common as more and more middle class and working class families rely on both, both of spouses working, if not full time, at least part time, in order to make ends meet. So the fact that these families have this traditional breadwinner homemaker household model just really emphasizes the fact that these men are wealthy. And it is that wealthiness that she says makes it hard for them to have egalitarian marriages, because it's the power dynamic in these couples is asymmetrical. The men make the money, and money is a well documented source of marital power. um, and additionally, she says oftentimes they engage in a certain amount of disparagement of a homemaker. And so women's domestic labor, women's care work in these families, in these households, isn't very valued. And so, of course, if women have less power in their own marriages, it's going to make it less likely that they're going to push to have more power and equality outside of their marriage in this country club space. And so, the other kind of two themes that she discusses is the fact that, women in this space are expected to exhibit femininity, and not just any femininity, but a form of femininity called emphasized femininity. And I have a background slide on that. So, in a previous reading, we discussed that, hegemonic masculinity. I now want to discuss, I don't want to say the opposite of hegemonic masculinity, but its female counterpart, which is emphasized femininity. All of both masculinity and femininity reference gender expression. So people have gender identities, man, woman being the binary terms. Um, and we expect people to then express their gender identities, through their behavior, through the way they dress, through their activities, through what they like and dislike, and we call that gender expression, right? And the two terms that are most commonly associated with gender expression are masculine and feminine. And although what we consider masculine and feminine can differ across cultures, and gender displays, which is how you display your femininity and masculinity, can also vary dramatically, it's worth noting that there are pressures to conform to whatever the conventional gender roles um, are in a society in most cultures. So most cultures do have a dominant way of thinking about men, thinking about women, of expecting, men to behave in, a masculine way and women to behave in a feminine way, even if their definition of masculine and feminine vary. And so at any given point, there are multiple masculinities and femininities in our society, but there's oftentimes a dominant kind of conception. And in a previous video, I've already discussed hegemonic masculinity, right? Which is this version of manhood that we kind of compare all man to be as the idealized man. Emphasized femininity isn't quite the same thing as hegemonic femininity, because, it isn't expected that all women are going to are going to uphold this version of femininity. And certainly since the women's movement, it hasn't been as dominant as the hegemonic masculine ideal. But in certain settings, in certain contexts, it is still the expected way for women to behave. And the emphasis here is on being, pretty and appealing and caring about your appearance in order to please men, having a pleasant, friendly personality. Once someone marries and becomes a mother, being nurturing, being a good homemaker. So, I have a couple of images here that that are frequently associated with emphasized femininity, cheerleaders and beauty queens, and that's June Cleaver from Leave It to Beaver, all just kind of, referring back to this traditional idea of what a woman should be. And like I said, although this isn't necessarily the dominant model in society anymore, it is certainly the dominant model in this country club. And so that's why she says on page 254 that the constraints of emphasized femininity don't leave a lot of cultural space for women to speak up on their behalf. Because in this setting, to be a good woman is to not be aggressive, it's not to be domineering, it's not to be making demands. That isn't what is considered to be feminine. And so the women in this setting, for their own sake, but also for the sake of their husbands, since most of them are in the club through their husbands, they don't want to push back against that feminine model. And then the final kind of point she talks about is masculine dominance. And so, she makes the point that, wealthy men at Old Family don't have to make a display of superiority over their wives. They don't have to engage in overt sexism because they have all of this, just established privilege. These are the men most likely to be, white and to be established, wealth, is the WASP core in society, the old blue bloods, as they refer to them. And so she talks about the concept of quiet control, right? When you have that much control, when you have that much authority, you really don't have to be overt about it. And she says that some of the other clubs, because the men are less elite, the sexism can become more overt. And just looking at this from an intersectional lens, she also makes the very interesting point that, for some of the Old Family members, when they talk about the other clubs and the sexism that occurs there, they also sometimes link it to racial ethnic identities and racial ethnic minorities. And so this also becomes a way of ethnic othering. Um, and so, her final points in these pages is that, class and race and versus gender kind of operate differently. She can see it in the accounts that people give when they're addressing race versus when they're addressing gender. And she kind of offers the analysis that that's because class and race depend on distancing mechanisms, right? While gender hierarchy kind of depends on a close symbiosis between men and women. Gender subordinates are closer to their dominators than race or class. So the race and class hierarchy is established by these boundaries that exist between whites and people of color. The class hierarchy is established by these boundaries that separate the upper class, where they live, where they send their children to school, the types of activities they engage in, than the middle class and the lower class. But the gender hierarchy, it doesn't exist in these like strict boundaries between men and women, because men and women are, married to one another in heterosexual marriages. They mothers mother sons, and fathers father daughters. So it isn't based around this concept of distance. In some ways, that kind of leads to people having a less progressive view of gender inequality than what they may even have in regards to certainly race equality. And it doesn't help that oftentimes people will have um, you know, they will believe that gender difference is more biological, um, and is in exists and is more natural than how people nowadays at least talk about race or class difference. And so, just to be clear, in sociology, the dominant sociological position is that to the extent differences exist between men and women, the bulk of those differences are due more so to society than biology. But it's also worth noting that the dominant position in sociology is also just that the amount of gender difference between men and women is rather minimal and is often overstated. So, she ends her piece by focusing on the ways in which, the triply privileged rich white men in the country clubs can experience those clubs differently than rich white women or even rich black men who have what she describes as the drag of one's subordinate status. There's one status in their matrix of privilege where they are not in fact privileged, and you can just think about how this might would lead them to feel uncomfortable or disenfranchised or mistreated or uncertain if they should speak up or speak out, in ways that a triply privileged individual in those country clubs would be less concerned about. So I end this video, as always, with some questions, for you all to consider. Um, Sherwood highlights the difficulties in studying up versus down. What do you think is to be gained by studying up? Can we ever truly understand stratification systems and social inequalities if we solely focus on subordinate groups? What is the distinction between studying up versus centering dominant narratives? Which, if you think back to an earlier reading on intersectional lens, they say that that's something that we should try to avoid when using intersectionality. My second question: how does being multiply privileged influence one's behavior and one's treatment as opposed to being multiply disadvantaged? What about those of us who, in the words of Sherwood, experience the drag of even one subordinate status? If we link this back to Sherwood's ending discussion of activism, how might these different types of intersections impact people's understanding of society and their desire to change it? So just some questions to reflect on and ponder and consider.